Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Critical Issues Forum, Teachers Online Workshop. We will start the second week of the CIF Online Teachers Workshop. Last week, we covered some basic issues about non-proliferation issues, including nuclear weapons science, world nuclear weapons status, and international non-proliferation and disarmament regimes. This week, we will cover some of the specific issues that have a more specific impact on international and regional security. Today's lecture is US Soviet Russia Nuclear Arms Control Overview. So I am very happy to have Dr. Nikolai Sokov for the CIF project this year again. So this year's topic, nuclear risk reduction, crisis prevention in a time of international turbulence. So it is particularly important for CIF students and teachers to study about these world's largest nuclear powers, US and Russia, arms control issues. Dr. Sokov is a senior fellow at PNIS, and he has extensive experience in diplomacy, especially arms control negotiations. From 1987 to 1992, he worked at the Ministry for Foreign Affairs of the Soviet Union and later Russia, and participated in START I and START II negotiations, as well as in a number of summit and ministerial meetings. Dr. Sokov has a PhD from the University of Michigan and the Soviet equivalent of a PhD candidate of Historical Sciences degree from the Institute of World Economy and International Relations. He graduated from Moscow State University in 1981. He has been invited to speak at numerous conferences and provide briefings to many organizations and governmental agencies, including U.S. Department of State, U.S. Department of Defense, and U.S. Department of Energy. So now I would like to give a microphone to Dr. Sokov. So now, Nikolai, microphone is yours.
Thank you, Masaka. Well, it's a pleasure to give this talk for you, and I hope that it will come useful as you prepare for the program. It's an excellent program. It's always really great pleasure to interact with both teachers and students. So today I will just talk about the bilateral US-Soviet Russian arms control. That's already a very long history. Negotiations began in 1969. And in fact, most of the time since that date, almost 50 years, well, it was quite rare that the two countries were not in negotiation. Yes, unfortunately, that's one of those periods today that we see. Negotiations on arms control began as part of the implementation by the United States and the Soviet Union of the obligations under Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And throughout the last 50 years, arms control achievements have been reported by the two states to the review conferences, the NPT review conferences, as activities that were conducted in implementation of the NPT. At the same time, we need to understand that arms control is not the same as arms reductions, right? I'm sorry, are not the same as nuclear disarmament. Arms control is activity that's primarily intended to prevent nuclear war, to stabilize the nuclear relationship between the two countries, to make sure that war does not start. So arms control in and of itself does not necessarily foresee complete elimination of nuclear weapons. But that's part of the process. So even if the two countries do try to go to the elimination of nuclear weapons, that has to be done through the means of arms control, so that at each lower stage, the strategic relationship remains stable. Today, I will talk about several topics. One is the role of nuclear weapons as it is conceptualized in the United States and Russia after the end of the Cold War. Yes, it's a short overview of what has been done in the arms control field. The treaties that existed or continue to exist. I will talk a little bit about the new challenges to strategic stability. And finally, we'll talk about the issues that have to be resolved in order to achieve the elimination of nuclear weapons. So the relationship between the two countries is based on the notion of nuclear deterrence. Yes, and nuclear deterrence is really a very simple kind of notion, fundamentally. Yes, it's not that simple when in real life, but the theory is really kind of straightforward. It's about the ability to respond to a nuclear attack with a strike that will inflict unacceptable damage to the attacker. If you have nuclear deterrence, if you have the ability to strike in response, then no one has the incentives to attack, right? Yes, and then you have the strategic stability. It's not just about numbers. It's also about the quality of the weapons, about their capabilities. It's also about the early warning systems and the ability to clarify uncertain situations and everything. In the past, during the Cold War, the relationship between the United States and Soviet Union was primarily based on nuclear deterrence. So two very large arsenals facing each other, clearly too big. A few people were really comfortable with the size of nuclear arsenals that the two sides had. That was a pretty stable state. Well, it was scary. There were several quite dangerous kind of moments when an early warning system reported attack when none was actually happening. But overall, it was very stable, and perhaps more importantly, the nuclear balance of the sheer size of nuclear arsenals and the perceived probability of nuclear war were so high that everyone was really afraid of nuclear war. Today we have a very different picture. Well, it's not just nuclear weapons that we need to worry about, but also about conventional weapons. And conventional weapons are, of course, much more usable than nuclear. We don't fear conventional weapons as much. At the same time, there is a risk. There is a risk that conventional conflict can always grow into nuclear, can escalate to the nuclear level. I would say that the situation is still more or less stable, but the risk of escalation today is actually significantly higher than it used to be during the Cold War. Well, basically, parties no longer as afraid of like a small-scale conventional conflict as they used to be in the past. But even a very small conventional conflict can escalate to nuclear level. And the future is highly unstable because we do face a transition in technology. We face a whole new generation of weapons with hypersonic speeds, which carry with themselves very high risk of escalation. So that's kind of all the situation in a nutshell. And let's now look at how we'll end it here, what's going to happen. So after the end of the Cold War, the role of nuclear weapons has fluctuated. As the Cold War was ending, many, including myself, believed that we're entering the stage of very fast, very deep nuclear reductions. Well, it still remained unclear whether we'd be able to completely eliminate nuclear weapons, but the majority certainly saw very, very deep reductions to levels much deeper than we have today, and also much, much faster. That did not come to pass. In fact, already in 2000s, already in this century, both the United States and Russia began to kind of play with increased role of nuclear weapons in their security policy. So it was quite paradoxical, I would say. Nuclear weapons continued to be reduced. Yes, they were reduced to very low levels, really. Like about 90%, something like that, roughly. Yeah, but at the same time, their role sometimes increased. Well, let's talk about the United States first. So 2002, U.S. Nuclear Posture Review. Nuclear Posture Review is the main guiding kind of document that determines U.S. nuclear policy. The concept of a new triad, which basically integrated nuclear weapons into the overall military capability of the United States. During the Cold War, nuclear weapons were very separate. They were so terrible, they were completely kind of separate, conceptually, strategically, everything. Here was an attempt to integrate them into the overall military and military planning. And during that time, the United States came up with a notion of possibly limited use of nuclear weapons in like a variety of circumstances. In fact, not necessarily against nuclear powers. There was a document that the United States worked on, that the US government worked on until 2005, that detailed the concept of limited nuclear use, like in the context of primarily conventional regional conflicts. Yes, and such scenarios included that the enemy has weapons of mass destruction, or these weapons are very hard to eliminate. They're in bunkers, or conventional forces of the enemy is superior to those of the United States, and so on. That period was short-lived. So by 2000, that policy, which was quite dangerous actually, it was abandoned following really massive wave of criticism. So the George W. Bush administration, which pioneered kind of this policy, had to abandon it. By 2010, already under the Obama administration, we saw a significant reversal of nuclear policy. The Obama nuclear policy became minimalistic, you might say. So nuclear weapons were only intended to deter nuclear attack against the United States. Only in extreme circumstances, and so on and so forth. Not really to be used against non-nuclear states. So we had like an almost 180% turn between 2005 and 2010 from one administration to another. Well, it should be, however, noted, I guess that's a very important point. The fourth bullet here basically says that the missions which had in the past been assigned to nuclear weapons will be supported by conventional weapons. So military missions remain the same, only the tools changed. But given the American superiority in advanced conventional weapons, well, it was to be expected that other countries might actually consider our reliance on nuclear weapons. So that's a questionable, actually, element, because if you are inferior to the United States and you face war, well, you might actually consider going nuclear. Yes, and that's not a good idea. And finally, under the current administration, the Trump administration, well, we did not see the same kind of idea about limited use of nuclear weapons in conventional conflicts, but we do see now, once again, increased role of nuclear weapons. Many more missions. Yes, it's not just about deterring global war. It's also the possibility of a limited use of nuclear weapons in great power conflicts. It's about introducing low-yield nuclear weapons on the assumption, and I'm completely certain that it's a wrong assumption, but some have it, that low-yield nuclear weapons would be less kind of dangerous, less destabilizing, and more acceptable. Well, I think that's a very wrong kind of notion, but yes, it's now shared by many in the current administration. Is essentially today we once again talk about return to the Cold War strategies in the United States. So as you can see, the evolution of nuclear policy of the United States has really been going in quite wild kind of turns, depending on the administration. In Russia, we see, we do not see wild turns in Russia, only one turn in 2000. Now, before 2000, and same as during the Cold War and continued throughout the 90s, nuclear weapons in Russia were conceptualized exclusively in the context of global conflict or World War III. So only massive use of nuclear weapons, last resort, end of the world. Right. 2000 saw a big change in that. The 2000 military doctrine added one more mission, that of regional conflict. What it means, it's a conflict that's not really global, but pretty much large scale, but more importantly, it's a conflict in which Russia is pitched against a great power, several significant military powers. Yes, of course, it's first and foremost the United States. The 2000 military doctrine was prepared under the impact of the war in Kosovo, which happened in '99. Yes, and that war really showed how the United States could, in fact, fight without immediate contact between forces, at long distances, with just conventional weapons. Of course, at that time, Russia was conventionally weak. Its conventional forces were outdated. So Russia decided that the only way to deter the United States from doing a Kosovo-style war would be to threaten nuclear strike. Yes, I just wanted to emphasize here that it was not about fighting a regional war with nuclear weapons. It was about preventing conventional regional war. Yes, here's a table. Please look at it later. In fact, many slides today will be just for your background so that you could better understand things. So as you can see, in 2000, Russia very seriously changed its nuclear policy, really for the first time since, I don't know, 1950s, 60s. Sometimes we call that nuclear mission deterrence of regional war. Sometimes it's called de-escalation. That's a contested kind of term. Contested term. So in Russia, most say, no, we don't have de-escalation. Well, frankly, that's just a term of convenience. You can call it de-escalation. You can call it deterrence of regional wars, and that's basically the same. I don't really see much kind of sense in talking about the words. It's more about the substance of things. But then things began to somewhat change. In 2010, although the doctrine remained the same, in spite of an attempt to further expand the role of nuclear weapons, that attempt was rejected. Well, instead, the threshold for employment of nuclear weapons was in fact increased. So from critical situation to the situation when the very the existence of Russia is under threat. So once again, we have lower kind of chance of nuclear use that's postulated in 2010 military doctrine. And the second big turn after 2000 came in 2014. And that's when the military doctrine introduced a new mission, conventional deterrence. What it means? It simply means that, so in contrast to 2000, Russia had already acquired advanced conventional weapons and no longer needed to rely primarily on nuclear. So the threshold of nuclear use increased even further. Is at the same time, we can see the same trend that we saw in the United States in the 90s and later, that it's not about reducing military missions, it's about transferring military missions from nuclear to conventional. So it's not less fighting, it's simply less nuclear fighting, right? So the two countries kind of have been moving lately, or roughly along the same kind of lines. Yes, once again, all the evolution of nuclear strategy in Russia and the role of nuclear weapons in Russia has been more kind of steady, if slow. In the United States, wild kind of turns, but like in the end, day-to-day share quite actually similar notions. So what happens now that Russia has advanced conventional weapons? How will the United States respond? Well, it was easy for the United States to reduce reliance on nuclear weapons while it had almost monopoly on them. But now that the monopoly has been lost, how will the United States and NATO respond? Will they emphasize conventional capability, or the new stage of conventional capability? Will they emphasize nuclear? That's how things were done during the Cold War. We don't really know yet. It might actually be seen, the 2018 Nuclear Posture Review, which I described a few minutes ago, could actually be seen as one possible response by the United States. And I'm really concerned that NATO might also return to greater reliance on nuclear weapons, that we might see introduction of new weapons. We might actually see American gravity bombs moved closer to Russia, for example, to Poland. So the situation in the future does not look stable. And it's effectively, when you replace nuclear weapons with conventional, it does not necessarily make the world any safer. Okay, so now let's look at arms control. Yes, and let's be. So the arms control scene, as we know it today, was really set at the end of the Cold War, the last few years of the Cold War, perestroika, and things like that. Yes, I was really part of those events. It was quite interesting time. We did some very good, some very useful job. It's unfortunately, we can only see this unraveling now, but all right, happens. So 3 elements that we need to talk about as we review that arms control kind of scene that was set so in the last years of the Cold War. The INF Treaty, the treaty that eliminated US and Soviet intermediate range missiles. And intermediate range is between 500 and 5,500 kilometers, but only those that are land-based. Is unfortunately same weapons, air-based or sea-based, were not affected by that treaty. It only applied to land-based. So very long negotiations. It was signed in '87. All missiles were eliminated within 3 years. By the spring of '91, and for another 10 years, the 2 parties continued to hold inspections and do other verification activities. So yes, that's like a background slide for you that includes specific kind of definition of the affected weapons. That was a really revolutionary treaty because it did constitute a breakthrough in verification. For the first time, there were on-site inspections, large-scale exchange of data, and so on and so forth. The second element of the arms control landscape was START 1. That treaty reduced strategic weapons of the 2 sides. As it was signed in the summer of '91. Unfortunately, it took quite a long time, more than 3 years, for it to enter into force. Because, well, as you know, by the end of '91, the Soviet Union broke apart, and it became necessary to regulate the nuclear heritage of the Soviet Union, because nuclear weapons remained in 4 countries, not just Russia, but also Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine. Yes, and Ukraine turned out to be particularly kind of difficult and hesitant. There were very complicated negotiations, so the treaty only entered into force by the end of '94. The reductions that were prescribed by the treaty were completed in 7 years, in 2001. The treaty remained in force until the end of 2009. Well, in fact, reductions that were implemented by the 2 parties were even lower than the treaty completed, than the treaty foresaw. So, in fact, it was deeper reductions. Okay, the background slide with like all the numbers and definitions, just for you to know. Verification was really massive. It was probably the most detailed verification so far ever. Short notice inspections, planned inspections, hundreds of inspections were conducted. Massive exchange of data. Just a list of all the weapons, all the strategic bases, all the facilities to produce missiles and store missiles was like about that actually thick. So it's really massive data. Telemetry information from all flight tests, and you name it. So that was really a very massive verification regime. Lots of transparency. Yes, I would say the downside of that regime, it was way too complicated. So it was quite cumbersome and very expensive. Yes, and we'll come back to that in a few minutes. But you know, when you have such a regime for the first time, you try to cover all possible, you know, contingencies, and okay. Well, that was a price at that time. We really had not much experience. And the third element of the arms control scene was tactical, or as I would rather actually like the term, on non-strategic nuclear weapons. So basically, that's nuclear weapons that were not covered by either the INF or START 1, so everything. When we talk about tactical, that usually like assumes short range, but many weapons that that were covered in that third part were, well, in fact, quite long range, such as sea-launched cruise missiles, which were not covered by the INF because they were sea-launched, right? So they fell under here. We don't have a treaty on non-strategic nuclear weapons. All we had, that's an important point, are two unilateral statements that were made by George Bush, who unfortunately passed away a few days ago. So look, in the end of September, George Bush quite suddenly made a statement that the United States planned to radically reduce nuclear warheads that were intended for short range or medium range delivery like vehicles, and the United States was only to keep about 1/3 of gravity bombs and well a bit more than 100 sea-launched cruise missiles with nuclear warheads. By the way, the latter were finally completely removed by the Obama administration so many years later. Like almost immediate, oh yes, and the statement, of course, did reflect the concern of the United States about tactical nuclear weapons that were outside Russia. So like almost immediately, Mikhail Gorbachev replied with very similar measures. Well, deeper reductions, well, somewhat deeper reductions, but then the Soviet Union had many more non-strategic weapons, actually short-range weapons. So that was okay. And then Boris Yeltsin confirmed, then expanded them in the name of Russia. The Gorbachev statement also included the proposal to negotiate a legally binding and verifiable treaty on tactical nuclear weapons. Unfortunately, the United States did not accept that proposal, so all we had was this informal regime, and informal regimes are by definition not very stable. So that was the scene as it was created at the end of the Cold War. So we had the INF Treaty, which had unlimited duration. We had START 1, which remained in force until 2009, and we had an informal regime on non-strategic nuclear weapons. Well, implementation of that informal regime took quite some time because, really thousands of nuclear weapons had to be eliminated. That's expensive and that's time-consuming, so it took quite a long time. However, in 2004, we faced this kind of problem that the non-strategic weapons regime was informal. It was not legally binding. And Russia simply said, we just see it as a goodwill statement, and we no longer consider ourselves bound by it. It's interesting, however, that according to very authoritative sources, Russia not only implemented all the reductions that it had promised to implement, well, in fact, it reduced significantly lower So that 2004 statement that Russia no longer considers all itself bound by the 91 regime was really not about nuclear weapons or their numbers or nuclear capability or things like that. It was more of a political statement about, well, how Russia treated informal regimes. And we will come to that a little bit later. And by the way, surprisingly, quite recently, well, literally like a few months ago, those PNIS, the regime of non-strategic nuclear weapons, was quite suddenly, like unexpectedly, once again mentioned by Moscow as an active, a real kind of regime that remains in force. So, it's not completely actually clear. So, as I said, parties were actually prepared for like deeper reductions than those that were foreseen into START 1. So like almost immediately in 92, the two countries began negotiations on the next treaty. I will not go into details, as you can see them here. But in fact, but the most important thing to take out is that the START 2 treaty was not the best kind of treaty. It contained too many holes. It was unequal. It would have been very expensive for Russia to implement. So in the end, the START 2 treaty never entered into force. There was an attempt to negotiate a START 3. Okay, well, START 2 doesn't work. So the Clintons administration decided, well, maybe we can jump over START 2 and get to a new treaty with even lower reductions. The framework that was agreed in 97 was good, was a solid foundation. Yes, unfortunately, for like a variety of reasons, all of them, domestic politics in the United States and Russia, in both countries, negotiations did not really take off, and by 2000 the treaty was not negotiated, as you know. In 2000, Republicans won the election. Well, it's quite possible that under Al Gore, the United States could have actually continued START 3 negotiations, and these talks would have maybe succeeded, but well, it just didn't happen. Throughout all these failed attempts, START 1 continued to be in force. So at least, even though negotiations failed, the two countries the START 1 treaty continued to ensure stability and transparency. In 2002, under the initiative George W. Bush, the United States and Russia signed finally a new treaty, the Strategic Offensive Reductions Treaty. I would say it was probably the worst arms control treaty in history, at least that I know. Well, at least like in nuclear weapons. Yes, it did provide for quite deep reductions, but it had no transparency, no verification, nothing. So it was just like a declaration of intention to reduce nuclear weapons. Now, Russia did not absolutely like such a treaty. Russia prefers much more detailed treaties. But okay, well, it was a concession to the United States. And once again, we still had our START 1 that provided kind of a stable framework for the relationship. But as we remember, START 1 was supposed to expire in 2009. And unfortunately, SORT was not kind of a document that could ensure predictability. A new treaty was needed to replace START 1, but the Bush administration was not interested in negotiating something serious, solid, verifiable or something. They really want as much flexibility as possible, and they didn't really care about arms control. It was also at that time that missile defense became a burning issue. So why we talk about missile defense, why it's important? Well, it's really quite simple. Once again, as I mentioned before, mutual deterrence is based on the ability to respond to an attack. So one side attacks, is another response. But what if the attacking side also has missile defense? And then the response will be stopped. Well, that creates a theoretical possibility of winning nuclear war. It's destabilizing. And if that side really sees that shield, well, it can either can build its own shield or just increase the number of offensive weapons. And this side will think, oh my God, they're trying to attack us. So anyway, you have a very unstable situation. So it's a very high probability of an arms race. So back in '72, the two countries signed the ABM treaty, the treaty that limited missile defenses. But already about 10 years later, the Reagan administration thought, no, we can create a completely reliable impenetrable missile shield. So we don't really need. Well, the idea was that the shield would be so impenetrable that nuclear weapons will just become obsolete. You cannot wage war, right? Well, that's in fact impossible technologically. So in fact, it only destabilized the situation. But anyway, starting in '83, the United States began a very long process of creating missile defense systems. So '83, the famous Star Wars. The program was pursued until the end of the decade. Well, even into the early '90s. Massive amounts of money was spent, and well, really nothing was created. Well, it's way too challenging technologically, simply. So in '92, George Bush, Senior, once again the president who died a few days ago, well, he could not really cancel the Star Wars, all right? That was politically challenging. Almost impossible, but he decided that it would be really good to have a US-Russian joint program to create very thin joint defense against limited accidental kind of strikes. Unfortunately, that was already '92, and he was not re-elected to the next term. But the Clinton administration really continued this very skeptical attitude to missile defense until the end of the '90s, when the Republican Party pushed through the plan to create a national missile defense system. Missile defense has been, well, quite popular among Republicans historically, starting with Bush administration. So, well, it was mostly a political move, but a lot of money was allocated. And it all ended under George W. Bush administration, when the United States completely withdrew from the ABM treaty. And, well, it became quite unstable because, at the very least, Russia did not try to increase the number of nuclear weapons, all right? The number of nuclear weapons continued to go down, but Russia engaged in a number of programs that allowed to penetrate the future missile defense kind of shield of the United States. Well, in fact, the United States still does not have a missile shield that really works, at least not against Russia. But the qualitatives of the arms race we already see. So the assumptions, the theories that were behind the 72 ABM treaty, they appear to be correct, most unfortunately.